The battlefield was more than just a clash of men. It was a canvas where the fate of civilizations was painted in steel and fire. Picture the thunder of hooves, the flash of blades, and the deafening roar of armies colliding under banners that meant everything. In those moments, victory didn't just belong to the bravest or the strongest, it belonged to those who wielded the most revolutionary weapons of their time. This is the story of 20 inventions that didn't just change battles, they reshaped the very fabric of medieval warfare, altering the course of history itself. Think about the longbow, a simple wooden curve that could pierce armor from 200 paces, or the trebuchet, a towering engine of war capable of hurling stones heavy enough to crumble castle walls. These weren't just tools of destruction, they were marvels of engineering, born from ingenuity and desperation. Behind each one lies a tale of innovation, of kingdoms rising and falling, of battles won not by sheer force alone, but by the brilliance of those who dared to rethink combat. Why does this matter to you? Because the echoes of these weapons still resonate today. The tactics they inspired, the borders they redrawn, even the legends they spawned, all of it shaped the world we live in now. So let's step onto that ancient battlefield together, not just as spectators, but as explorers uncovering the secrets of these game-changing weapons. From the stealth of the dagger to the raw power of the warhammer, each one has a story to tell, and by the end, you'll see the medieval world in a whole new light. To truly grasp why these weapons reshaped warfare, we need to step back into the world that birthed them. The medieval era wasn't just a time of knights and castles. It was an age of relentless competition, where kingdoms rose and fell at the edge of a blade. Picture Europe as a fractured chessboard, with every ruler scrambling for advantage. Armies weren't standing forces but temporary gatherings of farmers, mercenaries, and nobles, each clash a high-stakes gamble for survival. In this pressure cooker of conflict, necessity became the mother of lethal invention. Take the humble spear, for example. It might seem basic compared to later innovations, but in the hands of a disciplined formation, it was the backbone of early medieval warfare. Why? Because battles weren't just about individual skill. They were about cohesion, about turning a crowd of peasants into an unbreakable wall. The weapons that followed didn't just improve on this idea, they shattered expectations. The crossbow, with its mechanical precision, could punch through armor without years of archery training. The halberd combined the reach of a spear with the crushing force of an axe, making it a nightmare for mounted knights. Each breakthrough wasn't random, it was a direct response to the battlefield's evolving demands. But innovation wasn't just about metal and wood. The psychology of war played just as big a role. A trebuchet wasn't merely a siege engine, it was a terror weapon, its distant creak sending defenders into panic long before the first stone struck. The Morning Star, with its spiked ball swinging on a chain, was as much about intimidation as it was about brute force. These weapons didn't just win battles, they rewrote the rules, forcing armies to adapt or perish. And that's what makes their stories so compelling. They weren't just tools, they were the fingerprints of an era, each one telling us something profound about the people who wielded them. The longbow wasn't just a weapon, it was a revolution wrapped in yew wood and hemp string. Imagine standing on that muddy field at Agincourt, the air thick with the twang of hundreds of bows releasing simultaneously. In an era when most battles were decided by armored knights crashing into each other, this slender 6-foot arc of wood reshaped the very concept of warfare. What made it so devastating wasn't just its power, though an arrow shot from a trained archer could punch through plate armor at 200 paces, but its speed. While a crossbowman might manage 2 bolts a minute, a longbowman could loose 10 or 12 arrows in the same time, turning the sky black with death. The secret lay in its design and the men who wielded it. English law actually required every able-bodied man to practice with the longbow weekly, creating a standing army of skilled archers who could draw a 150-pound pull with ease. That kind of training produced muscles so overdeveloped that skeletons from the period showed telltale deformities in the shoulders and spines of these medieval marksmen. And when thousands of them fired in volleys, the effect was apocalyptic. At Crecy in 1346, English longbowmen cut down waves of charging French knights, their arrows finding gaps in armor, piercing horses, and turning the tide against what should have been an unstoppable force. But the longbow's legacy goes beyond battlefields. It leveled the social hierarchy of war. A peasant with years of training could fell a noble knight worth a fortune in armor, an unsettling idea for the medieval elite. It forced armies to rethink tactics, abandoning dense cavalry charges for more flexible formations. And when gunpowder eventually arrived, it was the longbow's shadow that shaped early firearm drills, proving that disciplined, rapid fire could dominate the battlefield. This simple weapon didn't just win battles, it changed who could win them and how. While the longbow demanded years of training to master, the crossbow offered something revolutionary: lethal precision at the pull of a trigger. Picture this: a foot soldier with minimal practice could load a bolt, take careful aim, and send it straight through the armor of a knight who had spent a lifetime preparing for battle. That was the crossbow's terrifying advantage. Its mechanical crank and locking mechanism turned the complex skill of archery into something almost anyone could wield effectively. No wonder it became known as the Equalizer of medieval warfare. Suddenly, a peasant with a week of training could drop a nobleman clad in expensive plate. What made the crossbow so devastating wasn't just its accessibility, it was its raw stopping power. At close range, its thick, short bolts could punch through chainmail and even penetrate thinner plate armor, something even longbows struggled with. Siege defenders loved it because they could fire from behind cover, picking off attackers one by one without exposing themselves. Mercenaries adored it for the same reason. It turned any group of hired fighters into an instant threat, no matter their background. But this power came at a cost. Loading a crossbow was painfully slow. While a longbowman might loose a dozen arrows in a minute, a crossbowman would be lucky to fire 2 or 3 bolts in the same time. That flaw dictated how the weapon was used. Crossbowmen often fought in staggered ranks, with one line firing while the others reloaded. Some armies even employed shield bearers to protect them during the vulnerable reloading process. And while it never replaced the longbow's rapid volleys on open battlefields, the crossbow excelled in sieges and ambushes, where a single, well-placed shot could decide the fight. Its legacy, a democratization of violence that forced knights to rethink their dominance. After all, when death could come from a device operated by a stranger with barely any training, the rules of war had changed forever. The lance was more than a weapon, it was the soul of mounted warfare, an extension of the knight himself. Picture the ground shaking as a line of armored horsemen leveled their lances, transforming into a wall of steel-tipped destruction. When couched firmly under the arm, this 12-foot spear multiplied the force of a charging warhorse, delivering impacts so brutal they could impale multiple foes in a single pass. But its true genius lay in its simplicity. Unlike the longbow or crossbow, the lance didn't rely on mechanics or training. It harnessed raw physics. Momentum became its deadliest feature. What made the lance unstoppable wasn't just its design, but the way it reshaped battle tactics. Knights didn't charge randomly. They moved in tight formations, their lances creating a bristling hedge of death that could break infantry squares like kindling. The psychological effect was just as devastating. Imagine seeing that wall of horsemen thundering toward you, knowing a single hit could lift you off your feet. No wonder armies crumpled before the charge even landed. Jousting tournaments refined these techniques, turning the lance into a precision instrument. Knights practiced for years to strike tiny targets at full gallop, and that skill translated to the battlefield, where accuracy meant the difference between a glancing blow and a lethal strike straight through an opponent's heart. Yet the lance had one critical weakness: it was a one-shot weapon. After the initial charge, it often shattered or became unwieldy, forcing knights to switch to swords or maces. That's why timing was everything. A perfectly executed charge could decide a battle in moments, but a mistimed one left knights vulnerable in the chaos of melee. And while later weapons like poleaxes and firearms eventually overshadowed it, the lance's legacy endured. It defined the image of the knight, inspired the evolution of cavalry tactics, and proved that sometimes the most terrifying weapon wasn't the most complex, just the one wielded with perfect, unstoppable force. The poleaxe wasn't just a weapon, it was a masterclass in medieval problem-solving. Imagine facing a knight clad head to toe in gleaming plate armor, nearly invulnerable to slashes or arrows. That's where this brutal hybrid came into its own, with an axe blade for slicing, a hammerhead for crushing, and a vicious spike for piercing. It turned every weakness in an opponent's defense into a fatal vulnerability. But what made it truly revolutionary wasn't just its versatility. It was how it reflected the escalating arms race of the era. As armor grew thicker and more sophisticated, warriors needed tools that could adapt on the fly, and the poleaxe delivered. Think of it like a medieval multi-tool. The axe blade could cleave through mail or lop off limbs, while the hammer's blunt force turned even the finest breastplate into a crumpled death trap. That spike, it wasn't just for stabbing. Skilled fighters used it to hook shields, yanking them aside to create openings, and with a handle up to 6 feet long, it outranged most swords, letting its wielder strike from a safer distance. But here's the twist: despite its brutal efficiency, the poleaxe demanded precision. A mistimed swing left you open to counterattacks, and its weight required strength to control. That's why it became a favorite of men-at-arms and knights warriors with the training to exploit every lethal option it offered. The poleaxe legacy lies in its ruthlessly practical design. While swords were symbols of status, this weapon was pure function, a response to the battlefield's evolving demands. When gunpowder eventually arrived, the principles behind it, adaptability, combined arms, exploiting weaknesses, lived on in new forms. It wasn't just a tool for killing, it was a blueprint for how warfare would keep changing, proving that sometimes the most effective weapon isn't the simplest, but the one that leaves no enemy untouchable. The mace didn't cut, it crushed, and that was its brutal genius. While swords slid off polished plate armor like rain off a roof, this deceptively simple weapon turned every armored knight into a walking target. Picture the physics of it: a solid metal head, often flanged or spiked, mounted on a sturdy shaft. When swung with force, it didn't need to pierce armor to be lethal. The impact alone could shatter ribs, rupture organs, or snap bones beneath the steel, turning a knight's greatest advantage into a deadly liability. What made the mace so terrifying was its specialized evolution. Early versions were little more than weighted clubs, but by the high medieval period, blacksmiths had perfected designs to maximize devastation. Flanged maces had protruding edges that concentrated force into smaller surfaces, multiplying the damage with each blow. Spiked variants could dent armor so severely that the metal would bend inward, pinning limbs or even trapping the wearer inside their own suit. and because it required minimal training compared to swords, no need for edge alignment or precise thrusts. Even novice fighters could wield it with bone-breaking efficiency. But the mace's real power went beyond physics. It was psychological warfare in iron form. The sight of a heavily armored knight crumpling from a single well-placed blow sent shockwaves through enemy ranks. Unlike arrows or spears, which killed at a distance, the mace was intimate, its damage visceral and unmistakable. That's why it became a symbol of authority too. Bishops and nobles often carried ornate maces, knowing their presence commanded both respect and fear. Long after plate armor faded from battlefields, the mace's legacy endured in military ceremonies, a silent reminder that sometimes brute force outshines finesse. The flail was chaos given physical form, a weapon that defied the rules of predictable combat. Unlike the controlled swing of a sword or the direct thrust of a spear, this nightmare on a chain moved in wild, whirling arcs, its spiked iron ball gaining terrifying momentum with every rotation. That unpredictability was its greatest strength and weakness. In the hands of a skilled warrior, it could curve around shields, strike over armor, and deliver blows from angles no rigid weapon could match. But one mistimed swing, and that same chain could wrap around its user's arm or rebound into their face, turning victory into gruesome self-destruction. What made the flail so feared wasn't just its brute force, it was the psychology behind its movement. Defenders couldn't anticipate its path like a sword slash or arrow volley. The chain added a split-second delay between the wielder's motion and the ball's impact, disrupting an opponent's ability to block or dodge. And when that spiked mass connected, the results were horrifying. Even if armor stopped the spikes from piercing, the kinetic energy could shatter bones beneath, leaving enemies crumpled and gasping. Siege accounts describe defenders on walls abandoning their posts at the mere sight of flail-wielding attackers scaling ladders, proof that its reputation often preceded its use. Yet the flail never became a standard battlefield weapon, and for good reason. Its lack of control made it useless in tight formations, where erratic swings endangered allies as much as foes. Most surviving examples come from dueling contexts or ceremonial roles, where its dramatic flair outweighed its impracticality. But in those narrow moments where it shone, ambushes, chaotic melees, or psychological warfare, the flail embodied a brutal truth. Sometimes fear was more potent than precision. Its legacy lives on in the way we still romanticize unpredictable, whirlwind forces in battle, a reminder that chaos harnessed just right could be as deadly as any disciplined strike. The halberd wasn't just a weapon, it was a declaration of independence for the medieval foot soldier. Imagine standing in a tight formation, watching a line of armored knights thunder toward you, lances leveled. For centuries, that sight meant certain death for infantry. But with this ingenious hybrid of spear, axe, and hook, everything changed. The Swiss perfected its use, transforming peasant armies into disciplined forces that could topple the mightiest cavalry charges. And the secret lay in its ruthless efficiency. At first glance, the halberd's design seems almost chaotic, a 6-foot shaft topped with a blade for slashing, a spike for thrusting, and a wicked hook for dragging riders from their saddles. But every element served a purpose. The spear point could stop a charging horse dead in its tracks. The axe blade cleaved through armor like parchment, while the hook yanked knights, accustomed to fighting from the safety of their mounts, into the mud where they were vulnerable. This wasn't just a tool for killing. It was a psychological equalizer, turning the knight's greatest advantages into fatal weaknesses. What made the halberd revolutionary wasn't just its construction, but how it was wielded. Swiss formations trained relentlessly, their movements synchronized to create an impenetrable forest of deadly steel. When cavalry charged, halberdiers didn't scatter. They braced, angling their weapons to create a lethal incline that horses couldn't breach. Then came the counterattack, a whirlwind of hacking, stabbing, and hooking that left armored riders sprawled in the dirt. At battles like Morgarten in 1315, outnumbered Swiss forces used these tactics to annihilate Austrian knights, proving that disciplined infantry with the right tools could humble the medieval elite. The halberd's legacy endures in modern warfare's core principle, adaptability. It showed that victory doesn't always go to the strongest or best armored, but to those who innovate. Long after plate armor faded, its spirit lived on in bayonets and combat engineering, proof that the best weapons don't just exploit weaknesses, they rewrite the rules entirely. The Zwehender wasn't just a sword, it was a statement, a towering 6-foot testament to the rise of professional warfare. Picture a mercenary striding onto the battlefield, hefting a blade so massive it required its own fighting style, one where the wielder often gripped part of the ricasso, the unsharpened base of the blade, to pivot and swing with terrifying precision. This was no knight's elegant sidearm. It was a brute force tool designed for one purpose, to dominate the chaos of the front lines, and in the hands of German Landsknecht, these giant's blades became the stuff of legend, carving through pikemen and shattering enemy formations like a scythe through wheat. What set the Zwehender apart wasn't just its size, though some weighed over 7 pounds, but how it redefined the role of elite infantry. While most soldiers relied on formation tactics, Zwehender wielders acted as shock troops, charging ahead to break spear walls with wide, cleaving strokes. Their signature move, the murder stroke, where they'd reverse their grip and hammer the sword's crossguard like a makeshift mace, crushing helmets with blunt force. But mastering this weapon demanded more than raw strength. Fighters trained for years to harness its momentum, turning its weight into an asset rather than a liability. The best could whirl it like a baton, using fluid footwork to avoid leaving themselves exposed during its sweeping arcs. Yet the Zwehender's true significance lies in what it represented, the dawn of specialized combat roles. These swords were so expensive and impractical for conscripts that only veteran mercenaries paid a premium as doppelsöldners could wield them effectively. Their existence signaled a shift from feudal levies to professionalized armies, where skill trumped social rank. And while later pike and shot warfare eventually made them obsolete, their legacy endured in the way modern militaries still invest in elite units with custom tools. The Zwehender wasn't just a weapon, it was a harbinger of warfare's future, proving that sometimes the most devastating force on the battlefield isn't an army, it's the right person with the right blade. The trebuchet didn't just break castle walls, it shattered the very idea of safety behind them. Imagine standing atop a fortress tower as the distant groan of ropes tightening echoes across the battlefield. Then, with a thunderous release, a 200-pound stone arcs through the air, slamming into the curtain wall with enough force to send masonry flying like shrapnel. This wasn't just a siege engine, it was the medieval equivalent of artillery, a terrifying blend of physics and psychological warfare that turned the tide of entire campaigns. What set the trebuchet apart from earlier catapults was its ruthless efficiency. Unlike torsion-based weapons that relied on twisted ropes, this giant leveraged gravity itself. A counterweight, sometimes weighing several tons, dropped with relentless precision, transferring energy through a pivoting beam to launch projectiles with deadly accuracy. Engineers could adjust the weight or sling length to fine-tune range, allowing them to pummel the same weak point in a wall repeatedly until it crumbled. And the ammunition, far from simple stones, historical accounts describe trebuchets flinging everything from burning pitch barrels to decapitated heads, even beehives or plague-ridden corpses, anything to demoralize defenders into surrender. But the trebuchet's true genius lay in its dual role as tool and terror. The mere sight of one being assembled outside a castle could trigger negotiations, as rulers knew resisting meant watching their life's work reduced to rubble. At the siege of Stirling Castle in 1304, Edward Longshanks ordered the construction of Warwolf, a trebuchet so massive it took weeks to build, only for the Scots to surrender the moment they saw it operational. Edward, determined to test his monster, made them wait while he obliterated a section of their fortress anyway. That was the trebuchet's power. Even when it didn't fire, its presence could break spirits. Yet for all its might, the trebuchet was a logistical nightmare. Transporting its massive components required ox-drawn carts and skilled carpenters, while assembling it under enemy arrows was a perilous task. That's why it thrived in an era of patient, grinding sieges, where time and resources outweighed swift victories. When gunpowder arrived, cannons eventually overshadowed these wooden giants, but not before the trebuchet taught the medieval world a brutal lesson. No wall was high enough, no gate thick enough to withstand the relentless march of ingenuity. Its legacy endures in modern siege tactics, reminding us that sometimes the most devastating weapon isn't the one that kills fastest, but the one that leaves no doubt resistance is futile. The Warhammer was the medieval armorer's nightmare, a weapon built to turn their painstaking craftsmanship into a death trap. Unlike the sweeping strikes of swords or the crushing blows of maces, this tool was all about precision. Picture a knight in gleaming plate armor, every joint and seam carefully fitted to deflect attacks. Then imagine the Warhammer's spike, no thicker than a finger, sliding through the gap between a visor and breastplate with the cold efficiency of a locksmith's pick. That was its genius. It didn't need to overpower armor. It just needed to find the flaws hidden beneath the surface. What made the Warhammer so devastating was its deceptive simplicity. At first glance, it resembled a standard tool, a short handle with a blunt head on one side and a slender spike on the other. But in combat, that duality became lethal. The hammer's flat face could dent armor, stunning the wearer or pinning limbs, while the spike exploited the resulting distraction to strike like a viper. Historical accounts describe fighters using it to hook shields, yank opponents off balance, or even target the thin mail covering armpits, a move as calculated as it was brutal. And because it was lighter than a mace or axe, it allowed for rapid follow-up strikes, turning every missed block into a cascading series of injuries. The Warhammer thrived in an era of escalating armor technology. As plate metal grew thicker, weapons had to adapt, and this was the answer, a tool that treated combat like a macabre puzzle. Swiss mercenaries famously paired it with halberds, using the Warhammer to finish off dismounted knights. Even on horseback, its compact size made it a favorite for cavalry, who could deliver pinpoint strikes without the awkwardness of longer weapons. Its legacy, a chilling reminder that in warfare, sometimes the smallest tools wielded with the right knowledge can be the most deadly. The Warhammer didn't win battles with spectacle. It won them by making every inch of armor a potential grave. The dagger was the whisper of death in a world of battlefield roars, a weapon so small it could be overlooked, yet so lethal it decided countless duels. Every knight, no matter how heavily armored, kept one within easy reach, often strapped to the hip or hidden in a boot. Why? Because when combat dissolved into the desperate chaos of close quarters grappling, when swords were too long to swing and maces too heavy to lift, the dagger became the difference between walking away and being left in the mud. Its design was deceptively simple. A narrow, double-edged blade, rarely longer than a man's hand, honed to a needle's point, but in the right moment it could pierce mail rings, slip through visor slits, or find the soft flesh between armor plates with chilling efficiency. Consider the brutal intimacy of its use. Unlike the sweeping arcs of a greatsword or the crushing blows of a warhammer, the dagger demanded proximity close enough to smell an opponent's breath, close enough to see the panic in their eyes. Historical combat manuals like Fior de Libris, Flower of Battle, depict fighters locking arms in grappling holds, one hand wrenching an enemy's helmet back while the other drove the dagger upward into the exposed throat. This wasn't the glamorous side of knighthood. It was the grim reality when honor gave way to survival, and that's why the dagger transcended class. Peasants, knights, even women concealed in their sleeves, anyone could wield one with devastating effect, making it the great equalizer in a society obsessed with martial hierarchy. Yet the dagger's legacy isn't just about violence. Its symbolism ran deep. In ceremonies, it represented loyalty. A lord might gift a dagger to a vassal as a bond of trust. In shadows, it became the tool of assassins, earning names like the Misericord for its merciless role in delivering final blows to wounded foes. And when gunpowder rendered plate armor obsolete, the dagger evolved rather than vanished, morphing into the Renaissance poniard and later the trench knives of modern warfare. Its endurance proves a timeless truth. In combat, sometimes the smallest weapon casts the longest shadow. The scimitar didn't just cut through flesh, it sliced through the myth of European martial supremacy. Picture a Crusader knight encased in steel, facing a Mamluk warrior on horseback. Before the knight could raise his heavy broadsword, that shimmering crescent of steel flashed once, a single, fluid motion, and the fight was over. This was the scimitar's brutal elegance, a weapon forged by cultures that understood speed, terrain, and the art of mounted combat in ways the West was only beginning to grasp. What made this curved blade so lethal was its marriage of form and function. Unlike straight European swords designed for thrusting against armor, the scimitar's arc concentrated force into a narrower edge, allowing slashes that could cleave through cloth, leather, and even chainmail with terrifying efficiency. Its balance tilted toward the tip, creating a natural draw-cut effect when swung from horseback, every galloping stride adding momentum to the strike. And because it was lighter than a knight's sword, a skilled rider could unleash rapid, whirling attacks without tiring, turning a charge into a blur of lethal precision. The scimitar's origins tell a story of cultural exchange as much as conquest. From the Persian shamshir to the Turkish kilij, variations of this blade spread across the Islamic world, each adapting to local warfare. When Saladin's forces faced Richard the Lionheart's crusaders at Arsuf in 1191, these blades didn't just win battles, they exposed the weaknesses of heavy European tactics in the desert heat. While knights sweltered in their armor, Mamluk horsemen danced around them, their scimitars darting in like vipers before retreating beyond reach. Yet the scimitar's true legacy lies in how it reshaped warfare beyond the battlefield. European armies, humbled by its effectiveness, began adopting curved blades for cavalry, leading to weapons like the Hungarian hussar's saber. It proved that innovation wasn't born in isolation, it thrived where cultures clashed and borrowed. Even today, the ghost of the scimitar lingers in modern military sabers, a silent tribute to a blade that taught the medieval world an unforgettable lesson. Sometimes the deadliest weapons aren't the heaviest, but the ones that move like lightning in the right hands. The Aquibis wasn't just a weapon, it was the thunderclap that announced the end of an era. Picture a medieval battlefield at dawn, where the clatter of armor and the shouts of knights had ruled for centuries. Then a new sound cracks through the air, the sharp, deafening report of gunpowder igniting, followed by a cloud of acrid smoke. In that moment, everything changed. This clumsy, slow-to-load tube of metal represented something unimaginable to the armored elite, a tool that could kill a trained knight with barely any skill required. What made the Aquibis so revolutionary wasn't just its firepower, though a well-aimed lead ball could punch through plate armor at 50 paces, but its terrifying unpredictability. Unlike bows or crossbows, which relied on physical strength and precision, this weapon harnessed the chaotic power of combustion. The flash and roar alone were enough to spook horses and break formations. Early versions were far from perfect. Misfires were common, reloading took agonizing minutes, and rain could render them useless. But none of that mattered when the alternative was watching your finest knights topple from their saddles, their expensive armor suddenly as flimsy as parchment. The psychological impact was even more profound. For the first time, a peasant with a day's training could kill a nobleman who'd spent a lifetime mastering combat. That shift in power unsettled the entire social order of warfare. At the Battle of Pavia in 1525, Spanish arquebusiers decimated French heavy cavalry, proving that gunpowder wasn't just a novelty, it was the future. Armies scrambled to adapt, swapping chainmail for thicker breastplates, then abandoning metal altogether as bullets grew more lethal. The Aquibis didn't just change weapons, it rewrote the rules of survival on the battlefield. Yet its legacy goes beyond destruction. The Aquibis forced armies to standardize training, leading to the first true infantry drills. It made warfare more democratic, weakening the knight's monopoly on martial prestige. And it set the stage for every firearm that followed, from muskets to rifles. In its smoky, unreliable way, this awkward prototype marked the turning point where warfare stopped being about individual glory and started being about technology's relentless march. The age of chivalry didn't end with a whimper, it ended with a bang. The Morning Star wasn't just a weapon, it was psychological warfare on a chain. Picture this, a spiked iron ball, each point sharpened to a needle's tip, swinging toward you in a deadly arc. Unlike traditional maces that relied on blunt force, this nightmare added a gruesome twist. Those spikes weren't just for show. They could punch through mail like a hot knife through butter, then lodge deep in wood, shield, or flesh, turning every strike into a potential death sentence. The real terror came when fighters tried to pull away, only to find the weapon's barbed embrace tearing flesh or yanking armor out of alignment. What made the Morning Star uniquely horrifying was its hybrid design. Part mace, part flail, it combined the crushing power of a weighted head with the unpredictable motion of a chain. Defenders couldn't reliably block it. The chain allowed the spiked ball to curve around shields at the last second, striking from angles no rigid weapon could achieve. And when it connected, contemporary accounts describe wounds that horrified even battle-hardened surgeons. Spikes could break off inside bodies, leading to infections that killed days after the battle ended. Some versions featured flanges that created a hollow cavity on impact, suctioning flesh inward for maximum damage, a medieval version of hollow point bullets. But the Morning Star's greatest power wasn't physical, it was fear. The mere sight of these weapons swinging in formation could make entire units falter. At the Battle of Grunwald in 1410, Teutonic knights reportedly broke ranks when Lithuanian forces charged with dozens of these spiked horrors whirling overhead. The sound alone was a weapon, the metallic hiss of chains cutting air, the wet thud of spikes finding targets, and unlike arrows or bolts that struck from a distance, the Morning Star forced opponents to witness its devastation up close, watching as comrades fell screaming, their armor punctured like parchment. Yet for all its terror, the Morning Star had critical weaknesses. That same chain that made it unpredictable also made it dangerous to wield. A mistimed swing could send the spiked ball rebounding into the user's face. It was useless in tight formations where allies might get caught in its wild arcs. Most surviving examples come from cavalry use, where riders could exploit its reach against foot soldiers. By the late 15th century, improved plate armor reduced its effectiveness, pushing it toward ceremonial roles. But for a brief, brutal window, the Morning Star reigned as the ultimate expression of a simple truth. On the medieval battlefield, sometimes the most powerful weapon wasn't the one that killed fastest, but the one that made enemies too terrified to fight. The billhook was proof that necessity could transform even the humblest tool into a battlefield nightmare. Originally designed for pruning branches or clearing brush, this curved blade on a wooden shaft became one of medieval warfare's most brutally effective improvisations. Picture a peasant militia facing armored knights, outgunned, outmatched, but holding weapons that could hook a rider's leg and drag him into the mud with a single tug. That was the billhook's grim genius. It turned everyday objects into instruments of war, rewriting the rules of engagement for those who couldn't afford swords or lances. What made it so versatile was its hybrid design. The hook tip could snag shields, yanking them aside to expose vulnerable flesh. The inner curve of the blade acted like a miniature axe, capable of severing limbs or biting deep into unprotected necks. Some variants added a spike for thrusting, while others flared outward like a cleaver, perfect for hacking through leather or mail. And because it evolved from farm tools, thousands already knew how to wield it with muscle memory born from chopping wood or harvesting crops. No noble training required, just the desperate ingenuity of people fighting to survive. The billhook's finest hour came during the 100 Years' War, where English yeomen used it to devastating effect against French cavalry. At the Battle of Agincourt, these peasant weapons helped turn the tide, their hooks dismounting knights who then floundered helplessly in the mud under a rain of blows. But its influence stretched beyond the battlefield. The billhook became a symbol of social upheaval, proving that effectiveness in war wasn't tied to status. When Wat Tyler's rebels marched on London in 1381, it wasn't noble swords they carried, it was billhooks repurposed once again, this time as tools of revolution. Yet for all its lethality, the billhook never lost its practicality. After battles, soldiers could use it to clear camp or build fortifications, a reminder that the line between tool and weapon was often as thin as the blade itself. That duality is its enduring legacy. While fancier weapons faded into obsolescence, versions of the billhook remained in use well into the modern era, adapted for everything from trench warfare to forestry. It stands as a testament to human resourcefulness, proof that when survival is at stake, even a farmer's implement can become the great equalizer. The catapult might not have had the raw power of its successor, the trebuchet, but what it lacked in brute force, it made up for in relentless adaptability. Picture a besieged castle at night, defenders huddled behind walls when suddenly the darkness erupts with flying fire, a barrage of flaming pitch pots arcing over the ramparts, igniting rooftops and storehouses. That was the catapult's signature move, not just breaking walls but breaking spirits. While historians often fixate on the trebuchet's dramatic stone-throwing feats, this ancient weapon quietly shaped medieval warfare through sheer versatility, proving that innovation isn't always about reinventing the wheel. Sometimes it's about refining what already works. What kept the catapult relevant for centuries was its modular design. Unlike the trebuchet, which required massive counterweights and precise engineering, catapults could be scaled up or down depending on the mission. Smaller versions, like the mangonel, used twisted ropes or sinew to store energy, allowing rapid deployment in field battles. Larger models could be dismantled and transported by ox cart, then reassembled under enemy walls in days. And their ammunition, far more creative than simple rocks. Siege accounts describe everything from barrels of quicklime creating choking clouds when they shattered, to rotting carcasses hurled to spread disease among defenders. At the Siege of Tyre in 1187, catapults launched clay pots filled with Greek fire, a napalm-like substance that burned even on water, turning the harbor into an inferno. But the catapult's true edge was psychological. While trebuchets pounded walls methodically, catapults could switch tactics on the fly, alternating between stone volleys to weaken fortifications and incendiary strikes to panic defenders. Their rapid-fire capability made them ideal for suppressing arrow fire from battlements, covering advancing troops, and because they were easier to operate than trebuchets, even novice crews could keep up a harassing barrage for hours. That's why you'll find them in accounts from the Crusades to the 100 Years' War, not as headline grabbers, but as relentless workhorses. The catapult's legacy is a lesson in endurance. Long after gunpowder arrived, modified versions lingered as backup artillery, their basic principles surviving in everything from naval ballistae to early cannon designs. It reminds us that on the battlefield, sometimes the most effective weapon isn't the flashiest, just the one that refuses to become obsolete. The estoc was less a sword and more a precision instrument, a needle-thin answer to the medieval arms race between blade and armor. While other weapons hacked or crushed, this rigid, triangular blade had one singular purpose: to slip through the microscopic gaps in a knight's plate like a surgeon's scalpel finding a vein. Picture a duel where every other strike clangs harmlessly off polished steel until the estoc's point snakes through a visor's sight slit or the vulnerable joint at the armpit, turning what looked like invincibility into a fatal weakness. What made the estoc so radical was its ruthless specialization. Unlike versatile longswords that could cut and thrust, this weapon abandoned all pretense of slashing. Its blade, often thicker than a man's thumb, tapered to a needle tip without a single sharp edge. The crossguard was minimal, the grip long enough for two-handed precision. Every ounce of its design screamed efficiency. No flourishes, no wasted motion, just cold mechanical advantage. Historical fencing manuals show fighters gripping the blade itself mid-swing, a technique called half-swording, to guide the point with deadly accuracy into armor's weak spots. This wasn't swordplay, it was armored combat reduced to its cruelest geometry. The estoc thrived in an era when plate armor had reached its zenith. By the 15th century, knights resembled walking tanks, their suits so finely articulated that they could somersault in them. Traditional weapons bounced off like hail on a roof until the estoc proved that no armor was seamless. At the Battle of Nancy in 1477, Swiss infantry allegedly used estocs to pick apart Burgundian knights trapped in the mud, their blades finding the gaps with methodical brutality. Even the name whispered its purpose. Estoc derived from the Old French for to thrust, a linguistic clue to its singular obsession. Yet the estoc's legacy is more than just its lethality. It symbolized a shift in medieval warfare's intellectual stakes. This wasn't a weapon for conscripts or peasants. It demanded intimate knowledge of armor's construction, the patience to wait for the perfect opening, and the discipline to ignore every other temptation in battle. In many ways, it foreshadowed modern warfare's trend toward specialization, where the right tool in expert hands outweighs brute force. When gunpowder finally made full plate obsolete, the estoc didn't vanish, it evolved into the rapier's slender predecessor, proving that even in warfare's darkest corners, elegance could coexist with savagery. The pavise redefined what it meant to take cover on the medieval battlefield. It wasn't just a shield, but a portable fortress. Picture a crossbowman kneeling behind a 4-foot-tall wooden wall, its surface reinforced with leather or metal strips as arrows clatter harmlessly against it. While other shields required constant maneuvering, This beast could be planted firmly into the ground, freeing both hands to reload the slow but deadly crossbow. That simple innovation turned individual soldiers into disciplined firing squads, proving that sometimes the best offense was an unbreakable defense. What made the Pavaise so ingenious was its dual role as both equipment and engineering. Unlike round shields designed for melee combat, these rectangular giants were built for stationary warfare, often featuring a central prop to keep them upright without support. Some even had notches for crossbow rests, turning them into makeshift firing platforms. During sieges, armies would line them up like a wall of timber, creating instant fortifications in open fields. The Hussite wars of the 15th century saw these shields used in wagon forts, forming mobile strongholds that could withstand cavalry charges. But their real brilliance lay in teamwork. While one soldier fired, another held a second pavaise ready to advance, creating a leapfrog effect that kept crossbowmen protected during their vulnerable reloading moments. The pavaise's legacy goes beyond its physical design. It reflected a shift in medieval tactics, where disciplined formations and coordinated fire began outpacing brute force charges. Wealthy mercenary companies commissioned elaborately painted versions, turning them into both protection and propaganda, their vivid scenes of saints or battles intimidating foes while inspiring allies. And when gunpowder arrived, the basic principle lived on in the mantlets used by early musketeers. The pavaise didn't just shield bodies, it shielded an idea that survival on the battlefield wasn't about glory, but about smart, collective resilience. In the end, its greatest triumph was making the humble act of standing still into a revolutionary tactic. The falchion was the medieval equivalent of a meat cleaver on the battlefield, a weapon that traded finesse for raw, bone-shattering efficiency. Unlike the symmetrical elegance of a longsword, this brute force blade featured a single sharp edge that widened near the tip, concentrating its weight into every downward chop. Imagine the impact. A well-placed swing could split shields, sever limbs, or even cleave through helmets with the same brutal finality as an executioner's axe. Yet for all its violence, the falchion held an unlikely status. It was the rare weapon equally at home in a knight's scabbard or a merchant's belt, blurring the lines between noble arms and commoners' tools. What made the falchion so versatile was its ancestry. Many historians trace its design to agricultural implements like the sickle or billhook, repurposed for war with a heavier blade and sturdier hilt. That heritage gave it an intuitive familiarity for peasants-turned-soldiers who could wield it with the same motions they'd used for harvesting crops. But knights and men-at-arms valued it too, especially in close-quarters combat where its weight and curve excelled at dismounting riders or finishing wounded foes. The curved edge allowed for devastating draw cuts, a slicing motion that turned defensive parries into offensive opportunities, leaving deep, ragged wounds that bled profusely. Surviving examples reveal surprising craftsmanship beneath the falchion's crude reputation. Some featured ornate hilts with engraved pommels, proving they weren't just tools of desperation but prized possessions. The Coniers falchion, housed in Durham Cathedral, bears intricate inscriptions and a blade pattern welded from multiple metals, a technique usually reserved for high-status swords. This duality captures the weapon's essence. It could be as refined or as ruthless as its wielder demanded. The falchion's legacy lies in its adaptability. When armor grew too thick for slashing blows, blacksmiths tweaked the design, adding a stiffer spine for half-swording techniques or a tapered point for thrusting. It thrived in border conflicts and skirmishes where speed and brutality outweighed precision, and its influence echoes in later blades like the German Messer and even the cavalry sabers of the Napoleonic Wars. More than any other weapon, the falchion proved that on the battlefield, sometimes the most effective tools aren't the most sophisticated, just the ones that get the job done with relentless, uncomplicated force. Greek fire wasn't just a weapon, it was a nightmare made liquid, an inferno that defied both water and understanding. Picture Byzantine warships patrolling the Bosporus at dusk when suddenly, a thunderous hiss erupts from their prows. A jet of flame, bright as molten gold, arcs across the waves to engulf an enemy vessel. The fire doesn't just burn, it clings like tar, spreading across sails and decks while sailors leap into the sea, only to find the flames chasing them across the water's surface. This was no ordinary fire. It was the medieval equivalent of napalm, a closely guarded state secret that kept Constantinople safe for centuries. The terror of Greek fire lay in its defiance of nature. Unlike ordinary flames extinguished by water, this sticky substance burned fiercer when doused, as if the sea itself had turned to fuel. Historical accounts describe it being launched through bronze siphons, early flamethrowers, that could spray fire in continuous streams or lob it in exploding parts. The effect was psychological as much as physical. At the Siege of Constantinople in 678, Arab invaders reportedly abandoned entire fleets after witnessing just one ship consumed by inextinguishable flames. The Byzantines called it liquid fire, but its victims called it witchcraft, a weapon so unnatural it seemed conjured from hell itself. What made Greek fire revolutionary wasn't just its composition, but the strategic advantage of its mystery. The recipe was known only to a select few, likely the imperial family, and a handful of chemists who prepared it in underground workshops. Ingredients remained debated: naphtha or petroleum base, perhaps mixed with quicklime that reacted violently with water, or pine resin for adhesive properties. The exact formula died with the Byzantine Empire, leaving modern scientists to speculate. This secrecy transformed Greek fire into more than a weapon. It was a deterrent, its reputation alone enough to make enemies think twice before attacking Byzantine shores. Yet for all its power, Greek fire had critical limitations. It was useless in calm seas where ships couldn't close distance, and dangerous to deploy. Many Byzantine crews perished when shifting winds blew flames back onto their own decks. Its siphons required precise maintenance. One clogged nozzle could turn the weapon into a suicide bomb. And when the Crusaders sacked Constantinople in 1204, the secret may have been lost forever in the chaos. The legacy of Greek fire endures in modern warfare's incendiary weapons, from flamethrowers to thermobaric bombs. But more importantly, it represents warfare's first true chemical arms race, a weapon whose power lay as much in its mystique as its flames. In an era before gunpowder, it proved that innovation could trump brute force, and that sometimes the most devastating weapon isn't the one that kills most efficiently, but the one that leaves enemies too terrified to fight. From the Longbow's rain of arrows to the Trebushet's earth-shaking impacts, these 20 weapons didn't just change battles, they rewrote the rules of war itself. Each one tells a story of human ingenuity, of civilizations locked in a deadly dance where survival demanded constant reinvention. Think about it. The crossbow turned peasants into marksmen, the halberd made infantry the equal of knights, and Greek fire defied the very laws of nature. These weren't just tools, they were revolutions forged in steel and fire, each one shifting the balance of power in ways their creators could scarcely imagine. But their legacy goes beyond the battlefield. These weapons reshaped societies, toppling feudal hierarchies and redefining who held power. The longbow's dominance at Agincourt proved that skill could trump noble birth, while the Aquibis heralded the end of armored knights altogether. Every innovation carried unintended consequences, like how the humble billhook, born from farm tools, became a symbol of peasant uprisings. Even in their brutality, these weapons pushed humanity forward, accelerating advancements in metallurgy, engineering, and tactics that echo in modern warfare. So which one left the deepest mark? Was it the trebuchet, whose psychological terror could crumble walls before the first stone flew? Or the Zwehender, a mercenary's badge of honor that signaled the rise of professional armies? Perhaps the dagger, a weapon so personal it blurred the line between knight and assassin. The answer depends on where you look. Some changed battles, others reshaped empires, and a few altered the very fabric of society. That's the fascinating thing about medieval warfare. Every weapon is a mirror, reflecting the fears, ambitions, and brilliance of the people who wielded them. They remind us that progress isn't always clean or kind sometimes. It's born from the relentless pressure of conflict. If you found this journey as gripping as a knight's gauntlet around a sword hilt, let me know which weapon fascinated you most in the comments. And for more deep dives into history's most pivotal innovations, hit that subscribe button, because the past isn't just a story. It's the foundation of everything we are today. Until next time, keep questioning, keep exploring, and remember, the echoes of these ancient battlefields still shape our world in ways we're only beginning to understand.